He learned early that sunlight made him visible, not in a dramatic way. Nothing burned, nothing hurt. But wherever the light fell fully on him, people noticed. At first it was subtle. A pause in conversation, a second glance that lingered just a little too long, a silence that arrived without explanation. He could never tell what they saw, only that something about him unsettled them. In bright cities, this happened often. Cities built around open squares, wide sidewalks, glass storefronts, and long afternoons. Places where the sun was not something to hide from, but something to celebrate. He tried to live normally in those places at first. He rented small rooms, worked jobs that required little talking, sat quietly in cafes where no one knew his name. He followed routines that blended him into the background, or so he thought. But light has a way of finding people. In the mornings when sunlight slid through curtains and filled the room, he felt exposed before he even left his bed, as if the day had already seen too much of him. He learned to wake earlier than most, while the streets were still muted and half asleep, before the brightness arrived and sharpened the edges of things. By noon, he stayed indoors. By afternoon, he walked only where shadows gathered naturally. By evening, he breathed again. People noticed anyway. A shopkeeper would hesitate before handing him change. A neighbor would stop smiling halfway through a greeting. A stranger on a bench would stand up and move, without knowing why. No one ever confronted him. No one accused him of anything. But the pattern repeated often enough that he began to recognize it immediately. It wasn't fear, it was discomfort. And discomfort draws attention. So he began to erase himself. He chose clothes that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. Muted colors. Fabrics that did not catch the eye. He kept his hair unremarkable, his posture small, his movements economical. He avoided habits that made people remember him. He paid in cash. He left no traces that lasted longer than a few days. Still, in sunlit places, it was never enough. He started leaving cities abruptly, always before someone could ask his name twice. Always before a routine could harden into recognition. He packed lightly. He learned to travel without anticipation. Each city followed the same rhythm: arrival, adjustment, observation, and departure. At first, he told himself this was temporary, that eventually he would find a place where light behaved differently, where brightness did not sharpen people's instincts, where being seen did not feel like being examined. But as he moved north, something changed. The days shortened. The sun lowered itself closer to the horizon. Light became indirect, filtered, hesitant. In these places, people themselves seemed less exposed. Streets narrowed, buildings leaned inward. Windows reflected grey skies instead of blue ones. Conversations grew quieter. No one lingered in open spaces longer than necessary. Here he noticed something unfamiliar. Relief. He could walk longer during the day without feeling watched. He could sit near a window without adjusting his posture. People still noticed him sometimes, but their reactions softened. The discomfort dulled, as if the dimmer light left less of him to be examined. He stayed longer than usual. Weeks instead of days. A month instead of a week. But even here there were limits. On clear days when the sun broke through unexpectedly and washed the streets in brightness, the old pattern returned. A tightening in people's expressions, a subtle recalibration of distance. He felt himself become an object again, so he continued north. He followed maps less and intuition more. He learned to recognize towns where the light rarely dominated, places where clouds gathered naturally, where winter arrived early and stayed longer than expected. Eventually, he reached a small town that did not seem designed for visibility at all. Snow covered most surfaces for much of the year, not the blinding kind that reflects sunlight sharply, but the heavy, soft kind that absorbs sound and dulls contrast. Buildings were low, streets were narrow. People moved slowly, conserving energy and attention. Here, even light seemed tired. The sun appeared briefly, low and distant, never climbing high enough to dominate the sky. Days blended into one another. Time lost its sharp edges. He rented a small room at the edge of town. The window faced north. Sunlight never entered directly. For the first time in years, he stopped measuring his movements. He walked during the day. He stood still without adjusting himself. He let his presence exist without constant correction. People noticed him here too, but differently. Not with discomfort, with neutrality. He became part of the background quickly. Another quiet figure moving through snow-muted streets. Someone who belonged simply by not demanding space. In this town, nothing asked him to explain himself. There were no bright afternoons to endure, no reflective surfaces to betray him, no urgency to disappear. He began to stay, not because he felt safe, but because he felt unexamined. And for someone who had spent years shrinking away from light, that was enough. He thought the town would let him disappear. At first it did. Snow softened everything. Sound, color, distance, even curiosity. He learned the patterns quickly, though when the streets were most empty. Which paths were used out of habit, not attention. Which buildings were passed without a second glance. He shaped his days around those rhythms, the way someone learns the breathing of a sleeping animal. He kept his routines small. Short walks, brief purchases, no conversations that required memory. Someone realized he never stayed in the light. Someone noticed he was never seen at certain hours. Someone else remarked that no one really knew where he came from. Questions appeared quietly at first. How long has he been here? Does anyone know his name? Where does he work? He answered as little as possible, and when he did, his answers were vague enough to slide past suspicion without satisfying it. That strategy had worked in other places. Here it only delayed things. Snow creates stillness, but it also creates time. People had long evenings, long memories, few distractions. They began to notice patterns where none had been named before. The first sign was distance. People stopped sitting near him. Conversations paused when he entered a room. A familiar look returned to faces he had hoped to leave behind forever. Not fear, not anger. Curiosity sharpened by boredom. Someone joked that he looked like a man hiding from something. The comment was made lightly, but it landed heavily. Others laughed, but the idea stayed. In small towns, ideas travel faster than people. Soon, Speculation replaced observation. Maybe he was avoiding someone. Maybe he had done something. Maybe there was a reason he never stayed anywhere long. The theory that settled most easily was also the simplest. He must be running. He felt it before anyone said it aloud. Doors closed a little quicker. Eyes lingered longer than before. Questions became more direct, less patient. One evening, he realized he was being followed. Not aggressively, not skillfully, just closely enough to notice. A shape behind him that slowed when he slowed, that stopped when he stopped. He changed his route 3 times before the shape disappeared. That night, he did not sleep. By morning, he made a decision he had hoped never to make again. He would disappear properly. He stopped being seen. He learned how to move when no one expected movement. He left his room before dawn and returned long after night had erased detail. He memorized which paths were visible from windows and which were hidden by snowbanks and trees. He became careful in a way that went beyond habit. He stopped leaving footprints that led anywhere meaningful. He stopped buying supplies from the same place twice. He stopped existing at consistent hours. For a while, it worked. People spoke about him less. The lack of sightings cooled their interest. Some decided he had already left. Others assumed they had imagined their suspicions. But not everyone let it go. A few people with nothing better to do and too much certainty began to look for him deliberately. Not out of fear, but out of the satisfaction of solving something unresolved. They wanted a name, a history, an explanation. They convinced themselves they were doing the town a favor. He noticed signs of this shift immediately. A moved object, a question asked twice. A presence felt where there should have been none. The old urgency returned. Not panic, calculation. He packed again, this time more carefully than ever. He left behind anything that could anchor him to the place. He waited for a night when the snow fell thick enough to erase evidence within minutes. He left without a destination. He followed the logic that had guided him for years. Less light, less people, less reason to be seen. He traveled north again. The towns grew smaller, the roads narrower, the gaps between settlements stretched longer. The sun dipped lower and stayed there like an afterthought. Here, people did not ask many questions, but they noticed newcomers instantly. There were too few strangers for anonymity to come easily, so he didn't stay. He passed through places that barely deserved the name. A cluster of buildings, a single store, a road that did not continue far enough to matter. Each time the pattern repeated faster. Arrival, recognition, departure. He realized something then. He was no longer just avoiding light. He was avoiding memory. Any place with enough people would eventually remember him. And once memory formed, light was no longer necessary. Suspicion could survive even in darkness. So he adjusted his search. He began looking for places where people themselves were temporary. Seasonal workers, transient communities, outposts where permanence was impractical. Places where no one expected continuity. Far north, beyond where maps were detailed, he found traces of such places. Settlements that existed more as agreements than towns. People who stayed only as long as condition allowed. Here, winter was not just a season, it was a filter. He moved slowly now, cautiously. He no longer thought in terms of hiding. He thought in terms of absence. How small could a life become before it stopped attracting attention? How little could someone exist without vanishing entirely? He followed roads that were barely maintained. He avoided places with reliable electricity. He preferred areas where the sun barely rose, where the sky remained a constant, indifferent grey. In one such place, he stopped for longer than planned, not because it was ideal, but because it asked nothing of him. There were few people and fewer questions. Everyone had their own reasons for being there, and none of them required explanation. Here, even suspicion was a luxury. He felt the pull of staying again, but he resisted it. Experience had taught him that comfort always preceded discovery. Instead, he kept moving. Always north, always colder, always darker. Toward places where being unseen was not a strategy, but a condition of survival. The farther north he went, the less the world seemed designed for permanence. Roads lost their names. Signs appeared less frequently. Distances stopped being measured in kilometers and started being measured in hours without seeing anyone. He adjusted his expectations accordingly. He no longer looked for places to settle. He looked for places that barely tolerated settlement at all. In these regions, people did not arrive with plans. They arrived with endurance. They stayed only as long as conditions allowed them to believe staying was possible. Winter decided everything. It determined who remained, who left, and who disappeared quietly without explanation. He fit into this logic easily. He found work that required no introductions. Carrying supplies, repairing things that no one wanted to fix themselves, watching over equipment that rarely needed attention, tasks that existed outside of curiosity. Here, people spoke little, not because they were unfriendly, but because speech cost energy. Silence was practical. For a time, this felt close to what he had been searching for. The sun rose briefly, if at all. When it did, it hovered low, offering light without warmth, visibility without exposure. Shadows were long and forgiving. The world existed in gradients rather than contrasts. Still, even here he did not fully belong. Belonging required history. History required a memory. Memory invited questions. He avoided all three. He stayed at the edges of settlements, in temporary housing, in structures that could be dismantled as easily as they had been assembled. He never unpacked fully, never arranged his belongings in a way that suggested permanence. People noticed him, but without urgency. New faces were uncommon, but not alarming. Everyone here had a reason for arriving late in life, until someone connected him to somewhere else. It began with coincidence. A man at a supply point mentioned a stranger who had passed through a southern town years earlier. Someone quiet, someone who avoided daylight, someone people had speculated about without ever understanding. The description was vague, but vagueness travels well. Another person recalled a similar figure in a coastal town, then another further south still. None of them were certain, but uncertainty did not prevent accumulation. By the time the idea reached him, it had already taken shape without his involvement. There was a man moving north, always north, leaving places just as people began to notice him. In places where life moved slowly, Patterns stood out. He sensed the shift immediately, not through confrontation, but through tone. Conversations stopped when he approached. Questions resurfaced, framed casually but aimed carefully. "You've been further south, haven't you? You travel a lot. You don't talk much about where you've been." He responded as he always had, with half answers that dissolved rather than settled. But this time, they didn't dissolve completely. A few people began to pay attention not to him, but to his absence. When he left rooms, when he changed routines, when he chose not to appear at all. Attention returned, not aggressive, not coordinated, but persistent. Someone followed him one evening, far enough to confirm suspicion, not far enough to be certain of anything useful. Someone else noticed tracks in the snow that did not align with the usual patterns of the settlement. He realized then that it was no longer the light he was avoiding. It was recognition. Recognition did not require brightness, only repetition. That night, he made his calculations carefully. If people followed him further north, it would only confirm what they already suspected. If he stayed, curiosity would harden into certainty. If he disappeared entirely, the story would outgrow him. He needed a place where curiosity could not survive. Places where people did not look for answers because survival itself demanded full attention. So he went further, beyond maintained roads, beyond regular supply routes, beyond places where people stayed longer than a season. He followed tracks left by those who had no intention of being found again. Hunters, temporary workers, individuals who lived between official points on the map. Here, settlements were suggestions rather than structures. A cluster of buildings near a frozen inlet, a few generators humming against the cold. People who measured time by weather rather than calendars. The sun barely appeared. When it did not rise. It slid sideways across the sky, indifferent and distant. Here no one asked for names. Here no one assumed continuity. Everyone was temporary, even if they had been there for years. He felt the difference immediately. Not relief, not safety, but neutrality. He became another figure moving through a landscape that resisted attention. Someone whose presence did not disrupt patterns because patterns were already fragile. He stayed longer than he had planned, not because he felt accepted, but because no one seemed to notice whether he stayed or left. This was closer than he had ever come, yet even here the past followed him faintly. A few people from further south arrived eventually, not together, not openly searching. But their questions carried familiarity. They had heard of someone, a man who avoided daylight, a man who moved north. They wondered if he might be here. He listened without reacting. He learned how rumors sounded when spoken aloud by people who did not realize they were describing him. They speculated freely. Maybe he was hiding from the law. Maybe he had done something irreversible. Maybe the light bothered him for reasons no one wanted to imagine. They built a story without him. And stories he knew were more dangerous than facts. He adjusted again. He began to live at hours when even this place slept. He avoided communal spaces entirely. He learned routes that left no trace long enough to matter. He reduced his interactions to necessity alone. Eventually, even those who had followed the idea of him north grew tired. Cold discourages obsession. Isolation erodes narrative. One by one, they left. The idea faded. And finally, he reached the edge of what he had been searching for all along, a place where the sun was an abstraction. Where days were measured by survival tasks rather than light. Where the world did not reward being seen. He stopped moving, not because he had nowhere left to go, but because going further would mean leaving humanity entirely. Here, existence was quiet enough. Here, he could live without explanation. His departure from the town was not sudden. No one saw him leave, yet everyone understood that he was gone. People noticed it in small ways. The silhouette that used to pass quietly along the edge of the street at dawn no longer appeared. The window that never reflected sunlight stayed dark, even at noon. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. It felt less like a man leaving and more like a presence withdrawing itself. He did not take the main road north. The paved road remained exposed for too many hours of the day, washed in pale winter light. Instead, he followed paths that did not exist on maps. Old hunting trails, frozen riverbanks, routes shaped by animals rather than people. He moved only when the sun was low or hidden. When light broke through the clouds, he stopped. He waited, sometimes for hours, sometimes for entire days. The farther north he went, the thinner the signs of human life became. Houses turned into cabins. Cabins turned into ruins. Then even those disappeared. It was there, beyond the last traces of settlement, that he found the cave. It was not large. It did not look dramatic. From a distance, it could be mistaken for a shadow where the rock folded inward. Snow gathered around its mouth, partially sealing it, as if the land itself were trying to hide it. Inside, the air was still. Cold, but consistent. No sudden changes, no sharp reflections of light. The stone absorbed sound, softened it. Even his breathing felt quieter here. For the first time in months, he did not feel the need to constantly calculate where the sun would be. The cave became his refuge. He arranged his life around absence. He learned how little movement was necessary to remain alive. He memorized the times when light might creep close to the entrance and stayed deeper during those hours. He ate sparingly. He slept irregularly. Time began to lose its edges. Days passed without meaning. Weeks without markers. At first, the world outside seemed to forget him, but the town did not. Stories began to form in the absence he left behind. People filled the silence with speculation. Some said he was running from something. Others said he had been hiding in plain sight. A few became convinced he was dangerous. They remembered how he avoided the sun, how he never stayed long in one place, how he never spoke about his past. Someone suggested he was a fugitive. Someone else said criminal. Someone whispered a worse word, inhuman. Curiosity turned into fixation. A small group decided to follow the trail north. They did not know what they were looking for, only that they believed there was something to be found. Proof, a name, a story that would make sense of his silence. They searched abandoned cabins first, then river paths, then the old hunting trails. The land resisted them. Snow erased footprints. Wind covered traces. Days passed with nothing to show for it. The man sensed them long before he saw them. Sound traveled differently in the cave. Vibrations in the stone warned him. Distant footsteps, metal against rock. Voices carried by cold air. He did not confront them. He did not flee immediately. Instead, he learned how to become invisible. He exited only at night. He erased signs of fire. He shifted deeper into the rock, into narrower passages where light could not reach, even by accident. For a time, they passed nearby without realizing it. But suspicion does not disappear easily. When they failed to find him, their certainty only grew. They convinced themselves he was still moving north, always farther from light, farther from people. And so he moved again. Leaving the cave was harder than leaving the town. The cave had given him something the towns never had: consistency, darkness without judgment, cold without curiosity. But even this place was no longer empty. He traveled deeper into the north, into regions marked only by silence. Places where the sun barely rose, where days blended into a prolonged dusk. Human settlements became rare, then non-existent. He searched for a place where being unseen would not require effort, where isolation was not suspicious but expected. Some followed him still. Fewer now, more uncertain, driven less by purpose and more by obsession. They never truly understood what they were chasing, and neither, perhaps, did he.